As I said earlier, when we talked about Roman houses, most of the Roman population, well over 90%, are going to live in apartments, not in individual homes. In fact, the idea of living in individual homes is kind of historically rare in any kind of urban environment. More typically, we see apartments or multifamily dwellings of some form. And these would have been quite large structures, as many as 5 stories tall, and vastly different from the luxury that we saw in the domus, or typical home of the middle class in ancient Rome. These are multi-story structures, and these would have been used because, well, land in the city is incredibly expensive. Initially, they're wood. Later, they're going to be required to be stone or brick due to fire codes. So after about 64 CE, we see the development of brick and concrete insulae. Before that, they were wood. And 64 CE, that's Nero's fire and all of that. So a lot of things going on there. But basically, you get the first building codes that we're aware of. You would have cooked in the hallways. The wealthier people lived on the lower stories, the wealthier people at the top. The poorer people at the top, the wealthier down below on the second floor. Why? Well, if you have a four-story walk-up, do you really want to walk up all those stairs all the time in a time before elevators? Also, it's going to be warmer in the upper levels, and the likelihood that you get out in a fire is going to be a lot lower if you live on the 5th floor, for example. We also see the use of public kitchens. So the kitchens were generally in hallways. These are going to be separate from the actual apartments. The apartments are frequently, especially for the poor, single rooms. The kitchens are outside of those areas, in part because they're using it as a common feature. It takes a lot of resources to maintain a kitchen, but in part because at the end of the day, the ventilation and everything else just makes sense to have, especially among the poor, 1 or 2 available per floor rather than having kitchens in every apartment. It also cuts down on your fire risk quite a bit. There would have been public bathrooms. Here's a depiction of it. The Romans used public bathrooms. These are intersex bathrooms, so either men or women would be using them. Here we're seeing a slightly different depiction. They're wearing pants, which wouldn't have been that common. But when you think about Roman clothing, the use of the toga and the tunic, really the idea of using a bathroom, a communal bathroom, wouldn't be nearly the problem that we see today because, well, there's nothing visible. And they apparently spend some considerable time there. Their whole conversations that happen, I have to assume they had a very low fiber diet. And just had to spend a lot of time there. And again, the apartments are arranged by income. The poor living on the upper floors, the wealthier down below, typically with larger apartments, larger homes, multi-room homes, some of them taking up an entire floor. So when you look at it, we run into a lot of issues, but we have a very efficient system. By the way, in terms of waste, oftentimes they're just dumping this stuff into the street, and the famous Roman sewers are running from the street. They aren't always running from the building. That's why we have so many covered walkways at the time. You would have caretakers that were there. You would have people who live so high that they would need to walk their water up because they're above the ability for any kind of pump to get water up there. And of course, you run into those fire risks in the upper levels. So it is, again, the social class playing out in their living circumstances. And it's really not that different from today. Obviously, today we kind of swap it. So the poorer homes, the poorer apartments are the lower levels, and the wealthier tend to be the upper levels in many cases because we have elevators. But at the same time, we still take those buildings, especially multi-class buildings, and we separate them similarly, where we have the wealthier in one area and the less wealthy in other places.